To avoid these sorts of confusions then, using emergence in a way that discreetly trespasses the boundary between the scientific and the magical, it really is necessary to undertake a kind of reconstruction of our concepts of causality. After all, the extraordinary fruitfulness of modern scientific method was achieved before all else by a severe narrowing of its investigative focus. This is very, very much, in a sense, the story of early modernity's scientific revolution. This involved the willful shedding of an older language of causality that possessed great richness, but that also seemed to resist empirical investigation. At least that was the prejudice of the time. The first principle of the new organon was a negative one, the exclusion of any consideration of formal and final causes, and even of any distinct principle of life, in favor of an ideally inductive method purged of metaphysical prejudices, allowing all natural systems, so I'm trying to check the time on my phone while I talk, allowing all natural systems to be conceived as mere machine processes, and all real causality is an exchange of energy through antecedent forces working on material mass. Everything physical became, in a sense, reducible to the mechanics of local motion. Even complex organic order came to be understood as the emergent result of physical forces moving through time from past to future as if through Newtonian space, producing consequences that were all mathematically calculable, with all discrete physical causes ultimately reducible to the most basic level of material reality. And while at first many of the thinkers of early modernity, as I said, were content to draw brackets around physical nature and to allow for the existence of realities beyond the physical, that is, mind, soul, disembodied spirits, God, they necessarily imagined these latter as being essentially extrinsic to the purely mechanical order that they animated, inhabited, or created. Thus, in place of classical theism's metaphysics of participation in a God of infinite being and rationality, they granted room only for the adventitious, finite, cosmic mechanic, or supreme being of deism, or, as it is called today, intelligent design theory. But of course, this ontological liberality was unsustainable. Reason abhors a dualism. Any ultimate ground of explanation must be one that unites all dimensions of being in a simpler, more conceptually parsimonious principle. Thus, inevitably, what began as method soon metastasized into a metaphysics, God help us, almost by inadvertence. For a truly scientific view of reality, it came to be believed everything, even mind, must be reducible to one and the same mechanics of motion. Those methodological brackets that had been so helpfully drawn around the physical order to allow for specific kinds of investigation now became the very shape of reality itself. It was always something of a fantasy, of course. For one thing, even as a method, the mechanical model extends only so far. Pure induction is an impossible ideal. In the life sciences, for instance, organisms can only very rarely be investigated without any hypothetical appeals to purpose whatsoever, or without treating organic structures as intentional systems. What's it for? Cui bono? What's the point of this organ? And it's only a metaphysical prejudice that then dictates that the proposive language is no more than a useful, indispensable fiction. Moreover, before higher causes like form and finality could be excised from the grammar of the sciences, they had first to be radically misconstrued. Even such residual Aristotelian terminology, for instance, as remained in the sciences in the 17th century, had already to a very great degree been mechanized, so to speak. You only need to read Francis Bacon to confirm this. I mean, instead of talking about the relation of act and potency in any event or any substance, we have talk of, say, agent and patient substances and interaction, and that interaction is understood as a mechanical interaction. This bears no relation to the antique categories that are being used. Form and finality had come to be seen as physical forces or influences extrinsic to a material substrate that in itself was not the pure potentiality save prime matter, but merely a universal, subtle, ductile, unarticulated physical stuff. The elements of nature were not imagined, as they had been in the classical and medieval synthesis, as having an intrinsic disposition toward order or vital integrity. Again, this makes sense in trying to create an inductive method. The elements of things were seen simply as inert ingredients upon which formal determinations were extrinsically impressed under the external guidance of final causes that operated merely as designs, factitious designs. That's why, again, something like intelligent design theory is a perfect example of an early modern metaphysics reasserting itself and mistaking itself for an antique metaphysics. And so, seen thus, form and finality soon came to seem not only superfluous suppositions, but little more than features of an inferior and obsolete mechanical model. Its mechanism was presumed. But of course, one can't really reject something one does not understand. Neither Aristotle's concept of an aetion, nor any, say, scholastic concept of a causa, actually corresponds to what we, following our early modern predecessors, mean when we speak of a cause in a physical sense. I think a better rendering of aetia or causae in the ancient or medieval sense might be explanations or rationales, or logical descriptions, or still better, rational relations. The older fourfold nexus of causality was not, that is to say, a defective attempt at modern physical science, but was instead chiefly a grammar of predication, describing the inherent logical structure of anything that exists, insofar as it exists, and reflecting a world in which things and events are at once discretely identifiable and yet part of the larger dynamic continuum of the whole. It's a logic, not a science in the modern sense. It was a simple logical picture of a reality in which both stability and change can be recognized and described, and these aetia or causae were intrinsic and indiscertibly integral relations, distinct dimensions of a single causal logic, not separated forces, only accidentally in alliance with one another. A final cause, for instance, was an inherent natural end, not an extrinsically imposed design, and this was true even when teleology involved external uses rather than merely internal perfections, as in the case of human artifacts. It was at once a thing's intrinsic fullness and its external participation in the totality of nature. Thus, in the Liber de Causis, one of the this remarkable book that Thomas Aquinas and others received from the Muslim philosophical world under the fiction that had been written by Aristotle, but Thomas was wise enough to recognize that it was nothing of the sort. It was actually a kind of digest of the metaphysics of Proclus, the great Neoplatonist, funneled through the Islamic monotheism. In the Liber de Causis, one of the principal causes of any isolated substance is the taxonomic category in which that thing subsists, the more eminent rational structure to which it belongs. So in a sense, a causal relation in this scheme is less like a physical interaction or exchange of energy than it is like a mathematical equation or like the syntax of a coherent sentence. Now, admittedly, this is a picture of reality that comes from ages in which it was assumed that the structure of the world was analogous to the structure of rational thought. But then again, this was an eminently logical assumption. If only because there appears to be a more than illusory or accidental reciprocal openness between mind and world, and because the mind appears genuinely able to penetrate the physical order by way of irreducibly noetic practices like mathematics and logic. In any event, perhaps it really was necessary to impose the discipline of this impoverished causal language on the scientific intellect. if only to direct its attention to the finest and humblest of empirical details. As I say, this is why modern science has produced such prodigies. But even so, as Hegel so brilliantly demonstrated, one can never really reason purely from the particular. Once the notion of causality has been reduced from an integral system of rationales to a single kind of local physical efficiency, it becomes a mere brute fact, something of a logical black box. Description flourishes, but only because explanation has been left to wither. So it was that Hume, having seen the spectral causal agencies of the schoolmen chased away, all those things that the medievals and the ancients talked about, Hume found causality itself now to be imponderable, logically reducible to nothing but an arbitrary sequence of regular phenomenal juxtapositions. Even mathematical descriptions of events now became nothing more than reiterations of an episodic narrative without any clear logical necessity. And this is indeed where we remain, in a sense. Wherever induction fails to provide us with a clear physicalist narrative for especially complex or exceptional phenomena, like consciousness or life, we now must simply presume the existence and force of physico-mechanical laws sufficient to account for the emergence of such phenomena, and we must, moreover, do so no less casually and vaguely than those schoolmen of old supposedly presumed obscure or occult, that's Hume's language, formal and final causes. We're no less dogmatic than our ancestors. We merely have fewer clear reasons for the dogmas we embrace. The older physical logic was coherent, though speculative. The newer is incoherent, though empirical. When mechanistic method became a metaphysics and the tinted filter through which it viewed nature was mistaken for an unveiling of its deepest principles, all explanations became tales of emergence, even in cases of realities, and again I would say life, consciousness, existence, where such tales seem difficult to distinguish from stories of magic.